The morning light hit Greenwich differently in April. It was the kind of spring light that made the old colonial buildings along the post road look freshly painted, like someone had gone overnight and decided that Connecticut deserved better than the gray it had been wearing all winter. The dogwoods were just beginning to open, white and pink, tentative at first, then suddenly certain, lining the streets of one of the wealthiest zip codes in the entire United States. Jonathan Carter noticed all of it from behind the wheel of his 2004 Ford F-150, a truck that had seen 3 transmissions, 2 cross-country trips, and 1 tour's worth of emotional weight that no vehicle had any right to carry. The seat had a permanent dip on the driver's side. The passenger window took 2 tries to roll all the way up. The truck was clean, because Jonathan was particular about clean, but it was not new. And in Greenwich, Connecticut, that distinction mattered more than most places would ever admit out loud. He adjusted his rear-view mirror. In the back seat, Ava Carter sat with her school folder open across her lap, going over the contents one more time. She was 10 years old and had the kind of focused energy that teachers either loved immediately or found exhausting by October. She reread the letter from her previous school's science coordinator, a glowing paragraph about her performance in their regional STEM competition, then carefully refolded it and placed it back in the folder between her standardized test scores and her personal essay about why she wanted to become an aerospace engineer. She had written the essay herself. Jonathan had read it twice and, privately, thought it was better than anything he had written at her age, though he was the kind of man who would never say something like that out loud, because he believed that admiration, when spoken too freely, sometimes had the unintended effect of teaching children to stop reaching. "You nervous?" he asked. No. She said it the way she said most things, like the question had already been answered before it was asked. Then she looked out the window. Maybe a little. That's healthy. Why is nervous healthy? Because it means you care. People who aren't nervous don't really want anything. He slowed the truck at a red light. And you want things. That's a good quality. Ava considered this the way she considered most things her father said, which was seriously and at some length. Then she nodded and went back to her folder. Jonathan turned onto Stanwich Road, and the entrance to Wexford Academy came into view. Even he, who had stood on airstrips in Iraq and Korea, and in front of congressional subcommittees, and in the offices of senators and school board superintendents in 14 different states, felt the particular weight of the place settle over him. Wexford Academy occupied 42 acres on the eastern edge of Greenwich, which was itself on the eastern edge of what the rest of the country thought of when it imagined old Connecticut money. The campus featured a Georgian brick main building that had been standing since 1891, a performing arts center that had been donated by an alumna who later became a federal judge, 3 athletic fields, a greenhouse, and a science and technology wing that the school's brochure described without apparent irony as state-of-the-art. The state-of-the-art in question was 2019 vintage, which meant it was good, but not exceptional. But Jonathan noted it with interest for reasons he would not share until he chose to. He parked the truck in the visitor section, a row of spaces near the side entrance, flanked by a silver Mercedes and a Range Rover so new it still had the dealer plate, and cut the engine. Ready? Ava was already reaching for the door handle. They walked through the visitor entrance together, Jonathan in a pair of dark gray chinos, a clean white Oxford shirt, and work boots that were polished but had clearly seen actual work, and Ava in a navy blazer over a striped shirt, her natural hair pulled back in a neat puff, her school folder held in both hands like she was carrying something fragile and important, which in a sense she was. The campus was, as advertised, beautiful. They moved slowly through the grounds, which a security staff member permitted with a nod and a visitor lanyard. And Ava did what Ava did everywhere she went, which was look at everything. She looked at the greenhouse through its glass walls and identified 3 species of plants she recognized from a book she'd read the previous summer. She paused outside the science wing and pressed her face gently against the window to see the rows of lab benches inside, the mounted periodic table on the wall, the cabinet of models along the back, a structural model of DNA, a model of the solar system, what appeared to be a working Stirling engine in the corner. "Dad." Her voice went quiet in the particular way it did when she was genuinely moved. "I see it. They have a Stirling engine." "I know. Do you think they let students actually use it?" "That's a good question for the admissions office." She turned away from the window with the look of someone who has just decided something with conviction. In Ava Carter's face at that moment was a declaration of intent so clear that Jonathan felt a quiet pride settle into his chest like a stone finding the bottom of a lake. Heavy and permanent and somehow exactly right. They made their way to the main administration building and pushed through the heavy wooden door into a reception area that smelled like old books and floor wax and money, in that precise order. The administrative secretary, a woman in her mid-40s named Helen, according to her nameplate, looked up from her computer and gave them the specific half-smile that professional office staff deploy when they're uncertain which level of attention a visitor deserves. "Good morning," Jonathan said. "We have a 10 o'clock. Jonathan Carter, for the admissions office." Helen typed something, looked at her screen, and typed something else. "Yes, for a prospective enrollment inquiry." She slid 2 visitor badges across the counter. "If you'll wait just a moment, someone will be right with you." The waiting area had 4 chairs upholstered in dark blue fabric, a glass-topped coffee table with the school's annual report arranged on it, and a framed aerial photograph of the campus on the wall. Jonathan sat. Ava sat beside him, opened her folder again, and added a note to something she'd written earlier. He did not ask what she was writing. He had learned early in her life that asking Ava what she was working on in the middle of working on it was like interrupting someone mid-sentence. Technically possible, but inadvisable. After 8 minutes, a door opened and a woman stepped into the reception area. She was in her late 40s, with the composed, carefully maintained appearance of someone who believed that professional credibility was a function of presentation. Her blazer was expensive. Her posture was practiced. She extended a hand, briefly, efficiently, and introduced herself. "Principal Whitmore, Rebecca Whitmore." She looked at Jonathan, then at Ava, then back at Jonathan. "Mr. Carter." "Good morning." He shook her hand. "Thank you for meeting with us." "Of course." She led them down a short hallway into a conference room, clean, well lit, with a view of the courtyard, and gestured toward the seats across the table from where she settled herself. On the table in front of her was a manila folder, already open. She glanced at it once, briefly. "So," she said, "you're interested in enrollment for your daughter." "I am. Ava will be starting 5th grade in the fall. We've been researching schools in the area, and Wexford has an exceptional reputation, particularly in the sciences." He paused. "Ava is passionate about STEM, has been since she was 6. Principal Whitmore glanced at Ava with the expression of someone acknowledging a fact rather than showing genuine curiosity. "What grade is she finishing now?" 4th. At Riverside Elementary in Stamford. And the reason for the move to private? Jonathan took the folder he had brought and opened it on the table. "I've prepared the full documentation. Her academic records, teacher recommendations, standardized assessment scores, an extracurricular summary, and a personal statement she wrote herself." He slid it across. "You'll also find her STEM competition results. She placed 1st in the Regional Mathematics Division last November, and 2nd in the Physical Sciences category." Principal Whitmore took the folder without opening it. Jonathan observed this. She held it for a moment, looked at the cover, which had Ava's name printed neatly in the center, the way Ava did everything, neatly and with intention, and then set it down beside her own folder. "Our admissions process is quite thorough," she said. "We typically see a large volume of inquiries for the fall semester." She folded her hands on the table. "I have to be transparent with you, Mr. Carter. Our 5th grade capacity for the coming academic year has been quite constrained. We've had considerable interest from returning families and from our waiting list." She offered a small, practiced expression of regret. "At this point, I'm not confident we have available space." The room was very quiet. Ava, who had been sitting with her back very straight and her hands folded in her lap, made no visible movement. But Jonathan, who had been watching his daughter's face with the corner of his attention for 10 years, noticed a very small, very controlled tightening around her eyes. It lasted less than a second. Then it was gone. She had learned, as children of perceptive parents often learn, to keep certain things internal. "I understand," Jonathan said. "Is there a waiting list process? Or a timeline you'd recommend for following up?" Principal Whitmore leaned back almost imperceptibly. "I can have our administrative team send over the formal waiting list inquiry form, but I wouldn't want to give you an optimistic picture that doesn't match the actual availability." She paused. "These decisions are made well in advance, and at this stage in the year—" "Of course." Jonathan smiled, and it was a genuine smile, though it carried more weight than the principal was equipped to read. "I appreciate your time." He stood. Ava stood beside him, folder in hand, and Jonathan picked up his own documentation. Whitmore had still not opened it, and slid it back into his briefcase. They walked out of the conference room, through the short hallway, back to the reception area, and through the main entrance into the courtyard. The April light was still doing what April light does in Connecticut, making everything look more significant than it would have in January. They had taken perhaps 30 steps toward the visitor parking lot when the main entrance opened behind them, and a different family came in. A couple in their early 40s, well-dressed, the husband in a jacket and a collared shirt, the wife in tailored slacks, their adolescent son between them. They had no appointment that Jonathan could see. There had been no mention of them during the wait, but as the door swung open to admit them, he could hear Helen's voice shift to a different register. Warmer, more forward. Jonathan stopped walking. "Just a moment," he heard from inside. And then, "I actually think we might still have some flexibility for fall enrollment. Let me get Principal Whitmore." He stood for a moment in the courtyard. The dogwoods moved in a small wind off the sound. Beside him, Eva stood perfectly still, her folder held flat against her chest, looking at the door that had just swung shut. "Dad?" "Yeah." She did not say anything else immediately. She was processing in the particular way she processed things that were painful and confusing, which was by getting very still and very precise, narrowing the question until it became something she could hold without flinching. "Did she not open our folder?" "No." "Why not?" He looked down at her, at the navy blazer, the neat, natural hair. The folder she had prepared with the care and seriousness that a 10-year-old brings to something they believe in completely. "Some people," he said, "make decisions before they have enough information to make good decisions." "Based on what?" He considered the answer carefully. Jonathan Carter had spent 30 years in the United States Army, had commanded soldiers in 2 combat zones, had built a company and a foundation and a reputation in fields where black men were historically not welcomed, and had spent the last decade specifically working to dismantle the systems that produced moments like this one. He was not, by any measure, unprepared for this conversation. He had known, with the instinct that comes from navigating institutions your whole life, that this was a possibility from the moment he pulled into the parking lot and saw the looks in the lobby and the way Helen's half-smile had not quite landed. But Ava was 10, and there were things that the truth could teach her, and things that the truth, delivered incorrectly, could take from her too soon. "Based on what they see instead of what's there," he said finally. "It's a mistake that some people make. It says something about them. It says nothing about you." Ava absorbed this. Her jaw was set in the particular way it's set when she was holding something difficult steady inside herself. "So what do? "We leave," he said, "with our heads up, and we find the right place. And the people who made that decision?" He looked at the entrance of Wexford Academy, the Georgian brick, the dignified columns, the school motto carved in limestone above the door, "By knowledge, forward." "They'll have to live with it," he said. "That's its own consequence." They walked to the truck. Jonathan opened the passenger door and Ava climbed in and set her folder on the seat with the careful precision of someone who has not given up on what's inside it. He came around the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled out of the visitor parking lot. In the rearview mirror, Wexford Academy grew smaller behind them. The dogwoods kept blooming. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Some conversations earned their silence. The drive home took 22 minutes. Jonathan drove the way he always drove, steady, attentive, without urgency but also without any of the particular kind of internal noise that other men, in similar moments, might have found impossible to manage. He had learned a long time ago, in places far less comfortable than Greenwich, Connecticut, that the usefulness of anger depended entirely on what you did with it after the first 60 seconds. After that, it was just weight. He was carrying some weight. He drove north along the post road until the old money of Greenwich began to give way to the slightly less theatrical prosperity of Stamford, and then he turned east toward the neighborhood where they lived, a quiet block of renovated colonials near the Ship Point waterfront, not the kind of neighborhood that featured in the town's promotional materials, but close enough to the water that in spring you could smell the sound through an open window. Ava had not spoken since the parking lot. She was watching the trees go by. In her lap, the folder sat closed. Jonathan had learned not to interrupt her processing, which was genuine and methodical, and required, when something had genuinely surprised her, a certain amount of uninterrupted space. It was when he turned onto their street that she spoke again. "Dad, did you know something like that might happen?" He thought about the question the way the question deserved. "I thought it was possible. And you went anyway." "Of course." He pulled into the driveway. "You can't let the possibility of a bad outcome prevent you from showing up." She considered this for a long moment, looking at the house, a white colonial with black shutters, a covered front porch with 2 chairs, and a small garden along the walkway that was currently doing what April gardens do, which is demonstrate that persistence actually works if you just keep waiting. "Is that something from the army?" "That one," he said, "is just from being alive." He cut the engine. "Come on, I'll make lunch." Inside, the house was the kind of clean that came from discipline rather than help. Jonathan kept it the way he kept everything, ordered and purposeful, with nothing in a place it didn't have a reason to be. The kitchen was at the back, with a window over the sink that looked out onto a small yard. Jonathan moved through it naturally, pulling bread from the cabinet, cheese from the refrigerator, beginning the particular kind of quiet domestic activity that in his experience did more for difficult conversations than direct confrontation ever managed to. Ava sat at the kitchen island and watched him for a moment. Then she opened her folder again and looked at her personal essay. She didn't read it, Ava said. No. So she made a decision without the information. She did. Ava stopped. She was not by temperament prone to the kinds of sweeping emotional declarations that some people use to process injustice. She was more precise than that. "That's irrational," she said finally. Jonathan placed a pan on the stove. "Yes, it is. And it's unfair. Yes, but we just left." He looked at her. "What would you have preferred?" Ava thought about this seriously, which was how she thought about everything. "I don't know," she admitted. I wanted to ask her to look at the folder. "My scores are good. The recommendations are good. The essay is—" She stopped, not out of false modesty, but because she was precise enough to know that self-evaluation was inherently unreliable. "I think the essay is good. It's excellent," he said. And he said it flatly, without decoration, because he wanted her to know he meant it as fact rather than encouragement. She looked up at him. "So why didn't we say something?" He turned down the heat on the pan and leaned against the counter, facing her. "Because," he said, "there are moments when saying something in the room only gives the other person the satisfaction of seeing that they've gotten to you. And there are moments when saying nothing is the more powerful choice, not because you don't have anything to say, but because the right audience isn't present yet." Ava stared at him. "That is a very complicated answer," she said. "It is. Are you saying that there's a right audience?" He returned to the sandwich. "I'm saying that every situation has a context, and sometimes the context you're in is not the context that will lead to resolution. Walking out of that room with our dignity intact was not surrender. It was strategy. Strategy for what?" He assembled the sandwiches, sliced them, and set one in front of her. "For what comes next," he said. She ate in silence for a moment. "Are you going to do something?" she asked. Jonathan Carter sat across the island from his daughter, and for a moment his face showed something that it very rarely showed, which was the quiet, settled satisfaction of a man who has seen many things arrive at their proper conclusion, and who has developed, over a long professional and personal life, the patience to let them do so without reaching. "I have a meeting tomorrow morning," he said. "At Wexford." Ava looked up sharply. "You're going back?" "I never fully left." He picked up his sandwich. "I was already scheduled. The meeting just had a different context than I shared with anyone there." Ava looked at him for a long moment with the specific expression she deployed when she was deciding whether her father was being genuinely wise or just being private for the sake of it. "Dad," she said. How long have you been involved with Wexford Academy?" He chewed, considered. "About 8 months." Her eyes went slightly wide, not dramatically, just with the controlled widening that in her face served as the equivalent of someone else's jaw-dropping. 8 months. "The foundation has been in preliminary conversations with their board of trustees about a significant capital investment. Tomorrow is the formal presentation to the full school council." He set the sandwich down and looked at her steadily. "I chose to visit the school yesterday as a parent, not as a donor. I wanted to see how the school operated when they had no reason to be on their best behavior." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, through the window over the sink, the yard was doing what April yards in Connecticut do, looking effortful and promising in roughly equal measure. Ava said slowly, "You were testing them." "I was learning," he said with the precision of a man who chose his words carefully. "There's a difference. A test implies I already knew the answer. I didn't. I hoped the answer would be different than it was." She was quiet for a moment. Then, in the careful voice she used when she was working through something that had moral weight, "And what are you going to do with what you learned?" Jonathan picked up his sandwich again, looked at his daughter. At the folder, still open on the island beside her plate, the essay still showing. "I'm going to make sure," he said, "that they understand exactly what happened yesterday. And then I'm going to give them the opportunity to be better than they were." He paused. "That's the only thing worth doing. Because institutions don't change unless the people inside them are given a reason to think about what they've done. And those people can't have the reason unless someone provides it." Ava thought about this. "And if they don't change?" she asked. "Then the investment doesn't happen. And they'll have to explain to their board, their parents, and their donors why they lost a partnership that would have funded a technology center and 50 new scholarships for students from across Connecticut." The word scholarships landed with a specific weight in the room. Ava, who understood the value of an opportunity, who had been raised by a man who had built a foundation specifically because he believed that opportunity should not be a function of what a family drove to a parking lot, looked at her father with an expression that was too old for 10 and exactly right for who she was. "Students from different backgrounds?" she asked. "That's the entire purpose of the fund." She looked back at her essay. Jonathan watched her. He watched her absorb the full shape of what had happened the previous morning. Not just the insult, which he had processed quickly and with characteristic precision, but the context, the architecture behind it. The fact that her father had walked into a situation carrying more information than the other side possessed, and had chosen to use that asymmetry not for humiliation, but for clarity. She was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and made a note in the margin of the essay. He did not ask what the note said. After lunch, Jonathan went to his study and spent the afternoon on a series of phone calls, all of which were unremarkable on the surface and consequential in their aggregate. He spoke with Martin Lee, the Foundation's executive director, and confirmed that the next morning's presentation materials were finalized. He spoke with the Foundation's legal representative about the terms of the investment agreement. He spoke with David Reynolds, the president of Wexford's Board of Trustees, who confirmed the full council would be assembled by 8:30. Jonathan did not mention the visit from the previous morning. He kept that information close, not out of vindictiveness, but because he had learned, over a long career in environments that rewarded patience over reaction, that information had more value at the right moment than at any moment before it. After dinner, grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, a habit from his years of military discipline that had simply continued because it worked. He sat on the back porch for an hour, while the April evening did what April evenings in Stamford do, which is cool slowly and smell like the water and make you feel, if you're inclined to feel it, that the world has more room in it than the bad days suggest. He thought about Ava. He thought about the look on her face when Principal Whitmore had set the folder down without opening it. He thought about the family that had walked in behind them, and the change in Helen's voice, and the phrase he had heard clearly through the administrative door. I actually think we might still have some flexibility. He had not been surprised. He had been hoping to be surprised, and he had not been. And there was a particular kind of grief in that. Not the fresh grief of a new wound, but the older, more familiar ache of a pattern that you have spent your professional life trying to disrupt, and that keeps arriving anyway. In polished lobbies and institutional spaces, and the confident assumptions of people who have never had to examine where their assumptions come from. He had spent 30 years in the army becoming an officer when the path was narrower for men who looked like him. He had spent 15 years building a foundation dedicated to the principle that a student's potential had nothing to do with their family's address or their parents' wardrobe. He had sat in boardrooms and congressional hearings and gala dinners and school gymnasium bleachers across 14 states, making the same essential argument in 14 different registers. That the country worked better when its institutions treated human beings as they actually were, rather than as they appeared to be. And he had pulled into Wexford Academy's visitor parking lot in a 22-year-old truck with his daughter and a folder of exceptional documentation. And within 12 minutes, he had received a demonstration that the argument still needed making. He was not angry. He was resolved. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. He went inside, checked on Ava, who was asleep with a book open on her chest, the folder on the nightstand, a habit she'd had since she was old enough to read and too interested in too many things to stop when it was time to sleep, and turned off the light. He set his alarm for 5:45. He had a presentation to give. The Wexford Academy Board of Trustees held their formal council sessions in the Harrington Conference Center, a wood-paneled room on the third floor of the main building, with tall windows facing the east campus and a long oval table that could seat 22. The room smelled of old wood and recent polish, and the particular combination of institutional gravity and personal ambition that characterized every serious meeting Jonathan Carter had ever attended, from military debriefings in Kuwait to Senate education hearings in Washington. He arrived at 7:58. He had driven the F-150 again. He did not have another vehicle. He parked it in the visitor section, noted the same silver Mercedes from the day before, which meant someone on the council or the administrative staff arrived early and drove well, and walked to the main entrance, where a different staff member checked his name against a list and handed him a visitor lanyard. He was escorted to the Harrington Center and offered coffee, which he accepted, and a seat at the far end of the table, which he declined because he preferred to stand near the window until the meeting was ready to begin. He had found, over 3 decades in rooms like this one, that standing put you in a position to observe the room rather than simply being observed by it, which was a distinction that consistently proved useful. The council members arrived in the way that boards always arrived, individually, in clusters, carrying the organized busyness of people who led departments or ran companies and had agreed to devote some portion of their accumulated competence to institutional governance. Jonathan had served on 4 boards in his life. He knew the type well, mostly good people, mostly well-intentioned, mostly operating from inside a set of assumptions they had not been sufficiently prompted to examine. David Reynolds came in at 8:17. He was 62. With the easy authority of a man who had been the tallest person in most rooms for long enough that it had become simply his natural posture. He had white hair, a firm handshake, and the particular quality of attention that distinguished people who had learned to listen from people who had merely learned to wait. He was the president of the Wexford Board, and had been for 9 years, and he was also the person who had originally contacted the Carter Educational Foundation 14 months earlier, after reading a profile of Jonathan in the Yale Alumni magazine and deciding, with the directness that made him effective, that this was a partnership worth pursuing. He crossed the room and shook Jonathan's hand. Jonathan. His voice was warm and genuine. David. Jonathan's was the same. Everything ready on your end? Fully? Jonathan set his briefcase on the side table. I appreciate the full council being here. Wouldn't have it any other way. This is a significant occasion. He looked around the room, which was filling up. The staff is joining us at 9 after the formal presentation. Rebecca's got the admin team assembled. He paused. How are you finding Greenwich? I know the drive from Stamford can be... I was here yesterday, Jonathan said. Reynolds looked at him. In a different capacity. He said it without inflection or particular emphasis, just as a fact, and let it sit there in the available space. Reynolds absorbed this in the way that competent men absorbed information that contained more than its surface suggested, not by immediately pressing for more, but by filing it carefully and waiting to understand the shape of the whole before reacting to any part of it. I see, he said. We'll get into that then. At the appropriate moment, Jonathan said. The meeting was called to order at 8:32. David Reynolds opened with a brief statement of purpose, a formal capital partnership between the Carter Educational Foundation and Wexford Academy, to include a significant multi-year investment in campus infrastructure and academic programming. The precise figure, when he stated it, produced a brief rearrangement of posture around the table, the specific kind of stillness that people perform when they want to appear not to be surprised and are surprised. The investment, as structured, would fund 3 primary initiatives: the construction of a new technology and science center to replace the existing 2019-era wing, the creation of an endowed scholarship fund that would fully support 15 students annually from households in the lower 2 economic quartiles of the state, and a paid mentorship program connecting current students with professionals in STEM fields. Jonathan walked through the presentation methodically and without flourish. Slide deck, projected on the wall screen, clear and precise and entirely free of the kind of aspirational language that dressed up weak arguments. These were not aspirations. They were commitments. The foundation had been making them for 15 years in schools across the country, and the data was available, and he had brought the data. He spoke for 31 minutes. When he finished, there were questions, good ones mostly, from board members who had clearly read the preliminary materials and wanted the specific details that preliminary materials always left out. He answered them with the same clarity he had used in the presentation. Then David Reynolds said, I'd like to take a moment before we vote to allow Jonathan to share something with the full council. Jonathan, when you said you were here yesterday, in a different capacity. Jonathan set down his presentation binder. The room was quiet. 14 people at the table, and the quality of silence that precedes the disclosure of something significant. Yesterday morning, he said, I came to this campus with my daughter. She's 10 years old. She wants to study aerospace engineering. She is, by any reasonable academic measure, an exceptional student. He did not say this with pride, but with the flat factual delivery he had used throughout the presentation, because it was a fact, and it deserved to be treated as one. I brought a complete admissions package, her academic records, recommendations, standardized test results, extracurricular summary, and a personal essay she wrote herself. We were seen by Principal Whitmore in the admissions office. No one moved. Within 12 minutes, Principal Whitmore informed me that there were no available spaces for the fall semester. He paused. As we were leaving, not 5 minutes after being told the school was at capacity, another family arrived without an appointment and was informed that there was, in fact, flexibility in the enrollment for the coming year. The silence in the room became a different kind of silence. Jonathan looked at the board members one at a time, not confrontationally, but with the direct, calm assessment of a man who had led troops and testified before Congress and funded programs in 14 states, and had enough standing in this room that he was able to say what needed to be said without raising his voice. My daughter noticed, he said. She noticed the folder that wasn't opened. She noticed the difference in how the 2 families were received. She asked me why. He paused. I told her the truth, which is that some people make decisions before they have enough information, and I told her that we would leave with our dignity intact, which we did. The room remained very still. Rebecca Whitmore was seated at the far end of the table. She was still. Her face had gone through several expressions in the time Jonathan had been speaking, and had arrived when he finished, at something that was not quite shame and not quite shock, but contained elements of both. The specific expression of someone who has been shown, with complete clarity, the distance between who they thought they were and what they actually did. Jonathan looked at her, briefly and without malice. "I did not share my foundation's involvement with this school when I visited yesterday," he said. "That was deliberate. I wanted to understand how this institution treated families. It had no particular reason to impress." He let that sit for a moment. The answer to that question is relevant to the Foundation's mission. We invest in schools that are genuinely committed to equality in their operations, not only in their marketing materials, but in the actual ordinary moments when no one with influence is watching. David Reynolds at the head of the table said, "Jonathan." His voice was careful and grave. "I'd like to be clear," Jonathan continued, and his voice had not changed register at all. Still calm, still measured, still the voice of a man who was deeply in control of what he was doing. "I am not here to punish anyone. I am not here to extract an apology or to create a public incident. I am here because I believe that this school has the capacity to be what it says it is. And I believe that the people in this room, if given the opportunity to understand what happened and the genuine motivation to address it, are capable of creating an institution that doesn't just accept diversity in its brochures, but actually treats all families with identical dignity the moment they walk through the door." He looked around the table. That is what the Foundation invests in. Not infrastructure. Infrastructure is a vehicle. The mission is institutions that actually live their stated values. He sat down. The room was very quiet. And then David Reynolds said with the measured weight of a man who understood that this was a moment that would define the next decade of this institution, "I think we have some work to do." It was not a small thing to say, in that room, in that way. But Jonathan Carter had spent his career in rooms full of institutions that needed to do some work, and he had found, consistently, that the first step was always the same: someone with the authority and the honesty to say so. What happened next in the Harrington Conference Center was not a vote, because some things should not be reduced to a vote. What happened was a conversation. Honest, uncomfortable in the way that necessary conversations always carry some discomfort, and productive in the way that conversations are productive when the people in them have collectively decided that being correct is more important than being comfortable. David Reynolds spoke first, after the room had processed what Jonathan had said. He addressed the council with a directness that had made him effective across 4 decades of institutional leadership. They had received credible testimony that a family had been treated differently than another family in their administrative offices, in a pattern consistent with bias. Whether the motivation was intentional or unconscious, did not reduce the impact on the family or the implication for the school's stated mission. The council would need to respond. The response needed to be genuine rather than performative. The question was how. He did not ask Rebecca Whitmore to speak immediately, and Jonathan respected this. It was the move of someone who understood that accountability worked better as a process than as a performance. The council members spoke in turn. Some of them were angry, not at Jonathan, but at the situation, which was a useful kind of anger, because it meant they were taking the reality of the incident seriously. Some of them were careful and legalistic, which was appropriate because institutions needed that register too. 2 of them were quiet for longer than their turns warranted, which Jonathan had learned long ago meant they were carrying something personal about the question. Either an experience of the pattern themselves, or a recognition that the pattern was more familiar than they wanted to admit. The overall tenor of the conversation was honest. Jonathan had been in rooms where the honesty didn't come, where institutions circled the incident in careful language until it disappeared into procedural abstraction. He had been in rooms where the initial response was so defensive that the actual conversation never happened, and the incident was simply filed away under the heading of unfortunate misunderstanding and left to calcify. He had learned to read, in the first 10 minutes, whether a room was going to do the work or manage the appearance of doing it. This room, in the first 20 minutes, showed the signs of actually trying. He didn't say so. It was not his role to praise the council for meeting a basic threshold, but he noted it. Rebecca Whitmore asked to speak at 8:57. She had been sitting in the same posture for the full conversation. Straight, controlled, but not the controlled straightness of defensiveness. More the controlled straightness of someone who is genuinely trying to hold something difficult, steady inside themselves while they figure out the right way to put it out into a room. "I need to say something," she said. Her voice was level, "and I want to be clear that what I'm going to say is not an excuse." The room was very quiet. She looked at Jonathan across the table. "Yesterday, I made an assumption about your family before I had any basis for making one. I decided within the first few minutes of seeing you what kind of enrollment conversation we were likely to be having. And I acted on that assumption." She paused. "I have worked in education for 23 years. I have given speeches about equity at conferences and written our admissions policy to explicitly address bias. And yesterday, in a 12-minute conversation with a father who came prepared and a daughter who deserved a fair review, I didn't open the folder." She said those last 5 words with a precision that suggested she had been sitting with them since Jonathan had said them, feeling the full weight of them. "I didn't open the folder, and that is a failure that I am responsible for." The room was very still. Jonathan looked at her steadily. He had heard many apologies in his professional life, some of them comprehensive and genuine, and some of them elaborate theater, and he had developed, over time, a reasonable ability to distinguish between the two. What he heard in Rebecca Whitmore's voice was not theater. It was someone who had been confronted with complete clarity, with the gap between who they believed they were and what they had actually done, and who had chosen. And it was a choice, and it was not an easy one, to stand in that gap rather than try to talk around it. He said, "I appreciate that." He meant it. "The question," David Reynolds said, "is what we do from here." He looked around the table. "Jonathan, before we talk about the partnership going forward, and I hope we do talk about it going forward, I'd like to ask directly, what does the foundation need to see from this institution before that conversation can continue?" Jonathan was quiet for a moment. He had anticipated this question. He had spent part of the previous evening thinking about it, on the back porch while the April night came in off the water. He had thought about what the right answer was. Not the tactically useful answer, not the answer that would maximize leverage or demonstrate strength, but the answer that actually addressed the thing that needed addressing. 3 things, he said. First, a formal review of the admissions and front desk interaction protocols. Not a policy review, which this school has presumably conducted before, but an operational review. How are families actually received? What happens in the first 3 minutes? Who makes the first evaluation and on what basis? The gap between policy and practice is where most of this happens, and it has to be examined at the practice level, not just the policy level. He looked around the table. Second, that review needs to involve input from families who've been through the admissions process, not just the ones who enrolled, particularly the ones who didn't. He paused. Third, the outcomes of that review need to be shared with the school community, staff, families of current students, prospective families. Not because anyone needs to be publicly shamed, but because transparency is how institutions build the trust that makes them genuinely excellent, rather than just apparently excellent. The board had been listening with the specific quality of attention that people bring to things that are going to require actual work rather than comfortable agreement. David Reynolds said, "And the partnership? If those commitments are made genuinely, not as a condition of the investment, but because the leadership of this school actually believes they're right, the foundation's proposal stands." Jonathan looked at him steadily. The center, the scholarships, the mentorship program, everything as presented. And if they're made as a condition of the investment? Jonathan's expression was measured. Then this isn't the right institution for this investment. The distinction was clear. It was also, for the people in the room who were paying attention, exactly the thing that separated genuine commitment from performative compliance. And everyone in the room was paying attention. After another 40 minutes, the council voted. The vote was unanimous on both matters: to accept the foundation's proposal and to initiate the operational review process immediately, with outcomes to be reported back to the full council and shared with the school community before the start of the fall semester. Rebecca Whitmore abstained from the vote on the partnership proposal, noting that it would be inappropriate for her to vote given her role in the events that had been disclosed. This was the right call. Jonathan noted it. The meeting ended at 10:23. In the hallway outside the Harrington Center, David Reynolds walked with Jonathan toward the elevator. "I want to ask you something," Reynolds said. "Go ahead. When you first reached out to us, or we reached out to you, 14 months ago, did you have any sense that something like this might happen? Was yesterday part of a deliberate process?" Jonathan pressed the elevator button. "No," he said. "Yesterday was a hope. I hoped the school would demonstrate that its practice matched its values. I was disappointed to discover it didn't. I'm not disappointed that I found out." He looked at Reynolds. "You can't fix what you don't know about." Reynolds was quiet for a moment. "What do you tell your daughter?" "I tell her the truth," Jonathan said, "which is that people and institutions can be better than their worst moments, and that the most valuable thing you can do, if you're in a position to do it, is give them the opportunity to prove it." The elevator opened. He stepped in. "I'll be in touch about next steps," he said, and the doors closed. Ava had school that day at Riverside Elementary in Stamford, where her fourth-grade teacher, Mrs. Anaya Torres, had written in her last report card that she demonstrated exceptional analytical reasoning and that her peers consistently turned to her when they needed help understanding a concept, which was the kind of thing that sounded like praise but was actually a description of a personality that was going to be very useful to people for a long time. Jonathan picked her up at 3:15. She came out of the school's front entrance with her backpack and a small clay model of a rocket she had finished in art class, which she was carrying with both hands and the specific care of someone transporting something irreplaceable. She had painted it blue and white. The proportions were, for a 10-year-old working in clay, remarkably accurate. She got in the truck and set the rocket on the seat between them with exquisite care. "How was school?" he asked, pulling out of the pickup line. "Fine?" She adjusted the rocket slightly. "We talked about the space race in social studies. Did you know the first American orbital spaceflight was in 1962? John Glenn." "Right." She looked at him. "How did it go?" "This morning." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding how much to share and in what register. She had learned to read this pause accurately enough to know it usually preceded something significant. "The meeting went well," he said. "And—" She stopped. Started again. "The school. The council heard what happened. Principal Whitmore apologized. Genuinely, I think." He glanced at her. "The investment is moving forward. They're doing a full review of how they receive families. And as part of the scholarship program, 15 students each year will have full tuition covered." Ava was quiet. She looked out the window at the streets of Stamford. A different kind of Connecticut than Greenwich. More complicated, more various. The kind of place where the school populations were more mixed and the parking lots had more variety, and the spring still arrived on the same schedule, but felt less like a magazine photograph and more like an actual season. "Will we go back?" she asked. "Would you want to?" She thought about this seriously. "I want to go somewhere that—" She stopped, organized the thought. "I want to go somewhere that would have treated us the same way, whether or not you had a foundation. Does that make sense?" Jonathan turned onto their street. "Yes," he said. "That makes complete sense. Can you know that about a place? Before you go?" "Not with certainty," he said. "But you can look for signs. And sometimes," he said, and his voice was careful, "the more important thing is whether a place can become that, even if it wasn't." She looked at the rocket in her lap. Then out the window. Then at him. "You think they can?" she asked. He pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. Outside, the garden was doing better than it had been. One of the early spring bulbs had finally committed to opening. "I think," he said, "that they have a real chance, because the people making the decisions are not defensive about what went wrong. And that's unusual." He looked at her. "Most people, when they're wrong about something, spend a lot of energy explaining why the wrong thing was actually reasonable. These people aren't doing that. At least not yet. Ava nodded slowly. She picked up the rocket with both hands and got out of the truck. Inside, she put the rocket on the shelf in her room between a photograph of a space shuttle launch and a library book about the history of jet propulsion. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she opened her school folder and found the essay, and she read it through from beginning to end. It was the fourth time she had read it since she'd written it. Each time she had read it looking for something different. The first time she'd been checking whether it was good enough. The second time she'd been looking for errors. The third time she'd been reading it after the visit to Wexford, through the specific lens of the folder that hadn't been opened. This time, she was reading it like a document that had survived something, like evidence. She picked up her pen and added 2 sentences to the final paragraph. She did not show them to Jonathan. He would read the essay eventually, the full version with the additions, in a different context, in front of a different audience, and it would mean something specific in that context. But for now, it was hers. That was appropriate. The best thing started as private. In the kitchen, Jonathan made dinner and called Martin Lee. The vote was unanimous, he told Martin. Full council. They're doing the operational review. Reynolds is committed, and I think Whitmore is actually going to do the work. Martin was quiet for a moment. And the center? Groundbreaking before December, if the construction planning goes on schedule. I want to make sure the scholarship committee is diverse. Include teachers, alumni, community members. Not just the board. Agreed. I'll draft the committee structure this week. A pause. How was the visit? Yesterday, I mean. Jonathan was quiet. Educational, he said. He could hear Martin deciding not to ask the follow-up question. Martin was good at that. I'll have the revised agreement to you by Friday, Martin said. Thursday, Jonathan said. I want to move quickly. The school has work to do, and the sooner the partnership is formalized, the sooner they can do it. He hung up and finished making dinner, and the April evening came in through the kitchen window, carrying the smell of the sound and the particular quality of light that belonged to that hour and that season. Warm and long and full of the specific promise that spring makes in New England, which is not a guarantee but is substantial enough to work with. The operational review of Wexford Academy's admissions and family reception procedures began the following Monday. David Reynolds had moved quickly, which was his characteristic response to things he believed were urgent, and he clearly believed this was urgent. He had contracted an outside consulting firm specializing in equity and inclusion practices in independent schools, and he had briefed the entire administrative staff at a closed session on the Friday after the council meeting. Jonathan was not present for the briefing. He had not been asked to be, and would not have agreed to be if asked, because his role was not to manage the school's internal processes, but to provide the facts and the investment, and then allow the institution to do its own work. Doing the work for them was not a partnership. It was a dependency. But he heard, through David Reynolds, what happened in that room. Rebecca Whitmore had briefed the administrative staff herself. She had described the events of that Tuesday morning in factual and unsparing terms. The family that had come in, the folder that had not been opened, the contrast in how the second family had been received, and what that contrast meant. She had not softened it or framed it as a misunderstanding, or attributed it to external factors. She had said, in front of her staff, that she had made an assumption about a family based on their appearance, and that assumption had led to a failure in her professional and institutional responsibilities, and that this was not acceptable. According to Reynolds, the room had been very quiet during this part of the briefing. After it, a front desk staff member, Helen, the administrative secretary from the Tuesday morning, had asked to speak. She had said that she had noticed the contrast too, in the moment, and had wondered about it, but had not said anything. She said she wished she had said something. That was, Jonathan thought, the most important thing that had happened in that room. Not the director's statement, which was necessary and correct, but the front desk staff member's acknowledgement that she had noticed and had not spoken. That was where the real work lived, not in the policy reviews and the external consultants, but in the individual moments when ordinary people inside institutions decided whether to name what they saw or let it pass. The external structures mattered, but the internal culture, the question of whether staff felt safe and responsible enough to speak, that was the engine of everything. He did not share this observation with anyone at the school. It was not his to share. He just held it as evidence that something real was beginning. The consulting firm began its work the following week. They conducted structured interviews with 17 families who had been through the admissions process in the previous 2 years, including 6 who had not enrolled. They interviewed 14 staff members. They reviewed written communications, intake procedures, and recorded data on inquiry to enrollment conversion rates, broken down by demographic categories. The preliminary findings, shared with Reynolds 6 weeks later, were detailed and specific and confirmed, with the specificity of data rather than anecdote, that the patterns were real and not isolated. The conversion rate for families from certain demographic groups was measurably lower, at statistically significant margins, than for others with equivalent academic profiles. The difference was concentrated in the first point of contact. Reynolds shared the summary with Jonathan over a phone call in late May. "It's hard to read," Reynolds said, and Jonathan could hear, in his voice, the particular difficulty of a person who had invested significantly in the belief that his institution was good, encountering evidence that suggested it had not been as good as he'd thought. "Yes," Jonathan said, "we're going to share it with the full school community. Staff, families, prospective families. Exactly as you asked." "I know." Is there?" Reynolds stopped. Started again. "I want to ask you something that I may not have the right to ask." "Go ahead." "Does it ever?" He paused. "Does it ever get exhausting? Doing this? Building things and then having to teach people why they need to be better before the things can work?" Jonathan was quiet for a moment. He was in his study, at his desk, in the late afternoon of a May day, looking out at the yard where the spring garden had fully arrived. Not just the early bulbs anymore, but everything that had been waiting. The roses along the fence beginning to show color, the hydrangeas filling out, the grass finally the proper deep green of late spring. "Yes," he said, "sometimes." A pause. "But the exhaustion is the cost of the mission," he said. "If the mission weren't necessary, it wouldn't be the right mission." He looked at the garden. "And the work would be a lot harder if I never saw it matter." Reynolds was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Jonathan said, "Build it right." The Carter Educational Foundation's investment in Wexford Academy was officially announced on a Tuesday morning in early June, in a press conference held in the Academy's main courtyard, a well-designed outdoor space with mature trees and stone pathways that in June looked significantly more welcoming than it had in the gray, institutional quality of a winter morning. The announcement included the full scope of the partnership: the construction of the Jonathan Carter Center for Science and Technology, a 60,000 square foot facility that would include advanced laboratory spaces, a robotics workshop, a design studio, and a dedicated mentorship program hub. The creation of the Carter Equity Scholarship Fund, which would provide full tuition to 15 students annually selected on the basis of academic merit from households that would not otherwise be able to access a Wexford education, and a community partnership initiative connecting the Academy with 3 public schools in the surrounding area for joint programming and resource sharing. David Reynolds spoke. The mayor of Greenwich, who had been briefed in advance, offered remarks. Rebecca Whitmore spoke briefly and said the things that a principal says at a press conference about institutional commitment and educational excellence, and she said them adequately, though she was more present when she moved off the formal remarks and said, simply, that she had learned something important recently about the gap between an institution's stated values and its daily practice, and that Wexford was committed to closing that gap. Then Jonathan spoke. He spoke for 7 minutes. He talked about why the foundation invested in educational institutions, not to put his name on buildings, which he noted he had generally resisted, but because he believed that the trajectory of a student's life was disproportionately shaped by the quality and character of the environment where they learned, and that the environment included not only the curriculum and the facilities, but the culture, The daily experience of whether you are treated as someone whose presence had inherent value. He did not mention Tuesday, April 14th, by name or by reference. He did not need to. The people who knew, knew. The people who didn't would learn, eventually, through the work that the school was doing to change itself. That was the appropriate scale of the thing. Not a public moment of accountability, but an ongoing institutional commitment that lasted longer than any press conference. Afterward, in the courtyard, while the assembled journalists asked questions and the school staff circulated with coffee, Rebecca Whitmore found Jonathan near the edge of the space, standing with his coffee and looking at the main building. "Mr. Carter," she said. He looked at her. Rebecca. She was different than she had been in the Harrington Center. Not the controlled, slightly armored professional of the council meeting, but something quieter, more considered. The way people sometimes are when they have been through a real process and have come out the other side actually changed, rather than just more careful. "I want to say something that I didn't say well enough in the council meeting," she said. He waited. "I've been thinking about your daughter," she said, "about how she came in with that folder and sat there while I explained why there wasn't space. And what I want you to know is that, whatever changes we make here, whatever the review finds, whatever the new procedures look like, the thing I'll carry is that image. A girl who cared enough to write an essay and put it in a folder and carry it into a meeting, and an adult who didn't take 30 seconds to open it." She paused. "That's the thing I was wrong about. Not the policy, the person." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. He thought about Ava on the porch that April morning, reading her essay one more time. He thought about the note in the margin she hadn't shown him. "She's going to be fine," he said. "I know," Rebecca Whitmore said. "That was never in question. I just wanted you to know that I understand what the question actually was." He looked at her for a moment. "The door's open," he said. And he meant both the school's door, which was literally and institutionally what they'd been discussing, and something else. The more essential thing about how doors worked, which was that they could be made to open, and that the making of that opening was where the work actually lived. She nodded. They stood for a moment in the June courtyard, the old brick, the mature trees, the spring finally having resolved itself into summer. And then the mayor's communications director appeared at Rebecca's elbow with a request for a photograph. And the moment ended, as moments do. Jonathan finished his coffee. He had a lunch meeting in Stamford at 1 o'clock, a preliminary conversation with a public high school principal who had reached out to the foundation after reading about the Wexford partnership in the Hartford Courant. There was always another meeting. That was not a complaint. That was the condition of work that mattered. He drove back toward Stamford in the F-150, windows down because June in Connecticut had earned the right to come inside, and thought about what was next. The Jonathan Carter Center for Science and Technology opened on a Saturday morning in early November, at a ceremony attended by 340 people. It was one of those days that New England saves for moments it wants to make memorable. Cold enough for coats, clear enough that the sky was the particular shade of blue that only occurs after the leaves have dropped, and the light stops being filtered by anything. The campus laid out in the clean November air with the specific gravity of a place that has decided to take itself more seriously than it did before. The building was beautiful. Jonathan was the kind of person who noticed functional beauty. Not decoration, but the beauty that came from design that understood its purpose. The center had tall windows throughout, flooding every laboratory and workspace with natural light. The robotics workshop was on the ground floor, visible from the entrance through a wall of glass. The design studio had writable walls, every surface capable of becoming a working space for whatever idea needed to get out of a head and onto a surface where it could be examined. The mentorship hub on the second floor had conference rooms that could expand or contract depending on how many people were in the conversation. On the north wall of the main entrance, in brushed steel letters, was a sentence Jonathan had chosen himself. "Every student who walks through this door deserves to believe they belong here." He had considered other options, something more formal, something more technical about the mission of the foundation or the programming of the center. But in the end, this was the sentence. It said the one thing that mattered. which was that belonging was not a reward for achievement or appearance, but a precondition of the education itself. The ceremony began at 10 o'clock. Ava was there. She was wearing her navy blazer again, the same one from the April morning, which she had not grown out of yet, which she wore now on occasions she considered significant, which told Jonathan something about what the navy blazer had come to mean to her. She was standing with a group of students she had met at the orientation sessions the school had held in October, a mix of returning students and new students, including several scholarship recipients who would begin in January. She had been accepted to Wexford Academy in late August. The admission had come through the standard process, reviewed by the new admissions committee. 4 people, including a community member and a teacher, as well as 2 administrators, and had included, Jonathan knew, a reading of her full academic file and personal essay by all 4 committee members. He had not asked whether the committee knew whose daughter she was. He believed they probably did. He did not believe it had mattered, because the file was, on its own merits, exceptional. He watched her from across the courtyard. She was talking to a girl her age, one of the scholarship recipients, he thought, from the demographic profile that matched the students the Foundation's fund had been designed to support. And whatever they were discussing it with the specific intensity of 2 people who have discovered that the other person thinks about something the way they do. Ava had her hands moving in the way they moved when she was explaining something she found genuinely interesting. It was, Jonathan thought, the right image. Not the press conference, not the council meeting, not the parking lot. This, 2 students in front of a building named for an idea, talking about whatever they were talking about with the particular animation of people who are beginning to understand that they belong somewhere. David Reynolds appeared at Jonathan's shoulder. "How does it feel?" he asked. Jonathan looked at the building, at the brushed steel letters above the entrance, at Ava and her new friend still deep in conversation. "Right," he said. "It feels right. We've already had 17 new scholarship inquiries since the announcement last month. Families we've never heard from before. That's the point," Jonathan said. "The public school partnership is going well. The joint science program starts in January. Teachers from Riverside Elementary." He stopped. Jonathan looked at him. "Riverside Elementary," Reynolds said, and his voice had a specific quality, "is Ava's old school." Jonathan nodded slowly. He had known this. He had chosen Riverside as one of the 3 partner schools specifically because of its demographics and its science program, which was good but underfunded. He had not mentioned this to Reynolds. "Is that—" Reynolds started. "Yes," Jonathan said simply. Reynolds absorbed this. Then he said, "You've been thinking about this for a long time." "Since before I knew about Wexford," Jonathan said. "The Foundation's been looking for the right institutional partner in this county for 3 years. Wexford had the campus capacity and the academic reputation. The culture needed work." He paused. "That's true of most institutions worth investing in." Reynolds was quiet for a moment, looking at the building. "You know, when I called you 14 months ago, when I read the profile in the alumni magazine, I thought I was doing you a favor, offering you a prestigious platform for the Foundation's work." Jonathan said nothing. "I understand now," Reynolds said, "that I was thinking about it upside down. The partnership benefits both parties," Jonathan said. "That's not something to be embarrassed about." "No," Reynolds said, "but the nature of the benefit." He stopped. "What you're offering is more fundamental than what we were offering." Jonathan looked at the brushed steel letters one more time. "Every student who walks through this door deserves to believe they belong here." "The facility is excellent," Jonathan said. "Your team built it well." It was the kind of deflection that was also an acceptance of the compliment, of the observation, of the whole long arc, from an April morning in a visitor parking lot to a November morning in a courtyard full of people who were, many of them, just beginning to understand the shape of what had happened. Later, after the formal ceremony and the tours and the coffee and the speeches, Jonathan found a few minutes in the mentorship hub on the 2nd floor, which was empty at that point. The guests were still moving through the lower levels. He stood at the window that looked out over the East Campus, where the athletic fields ran to the edge of the property, bare and brown now with November, but with the clean, geometric clarity of spaces that would be full again in spring. He thought about the arc of the thing. He thought about his father, a postal worker in Baltimore, who had driven a car with a faulty heater for 3 winters because he was saving for a computer, an actual personal computer, in 1987, which cost more than most people thought a postal worker had any business spending, so that Jonathan could learn to use it. He thought about the specific quality of his father's certainty, that education was the most direct route to a life of more options than fewer, and how that certainty had been communicated, not as pressure but as faith. Not you have to, but you can. He thought about Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Carter, United States Army, who had led troops in places where the difference between a good decision and a bad one was measured in something more consequential than money, who had returned from those places with a specific knowledge of what human beings were capable of when they believed someone saw them clearly and trusted them fully. He thought about the folder that hadn't been opened. He thought about Ava, 8 months ago, making a note in the margin of her essay. He had read the full version eventually, after the formal acceptance letter arrived in August. He had read it in the kitchen, standing at the island, and he had read the 2 sentences she had added to the final paragraph. Some doors are closed because people make decisions before they have information. The response to a closed door is not to give up. It is to find out where the door leads, and then to be the person who makes sure it opens the right way. He had folded the essay and put it back exactly where he'd found it, and had not mentioned it. He stood at the window of the Jonathan Carter Center for Science and Technology for another few minutes, in the clear November light. Then he went downstairs. Ava was waiting near the entrance with her new friend, a girl named Simone, he had learned, who was 11 and wanted to study marine biology, and who had a laugh that was loud and entirely genuine. They were standing in front of the Stirling engine, which had been relocated from the old science wing to the new center, and placed in a glass case near the entrance, like the centerpiece of a collection that understood its own history. "Dad," Ava said, "did you know they moved the Stirling engine from the old wing?" "I heard something about that. Simone doesn't know what a Stirling engine is." "I have a general sense," Simone said, with the mild dignity of someone accustomed to Ava's particular approach to information. Jonathan looked at the engine in its case, then at his daughter, then at Simone. "It works on the principle of temperature difference," he said. "Hot side and cold side. The difference in heat creates movement. The greater the difference, the more energy you can generate." Ava looked at him with the expression she had when he said something she thought was more than what it appeared to be. "It's just physics," he said. She kept looking at him. "Let's go find some lunch," he said. They walked out of the Jonathan Carter Center for Science and Technology into the November morning, clear, cold, full of the particular promise that belongs to things that have been properly begun, and across the campus toward the main building, the 3 of them, the old brick academy behind them, and the new glass and steel center they had just come from, and between those 2 buildings, the courtyard that in April had held 2 students, and a folder and a decision about what kind of place. This was going to be. It was going to be a different kind of place now. That was the work. That was ultimately the whole point. The November air was sharp and clean and full of the year turning toward its end, and the campus was full of people, students and parents and teachers and community members, who had come for a ceremony and found themselves, without quite planning for it, inside the beginning of something that would take years to fully understand. Jonathan Carter walked with his daughter and her new friend, and the dogwoods, bare now, but already holding inside their branches the knowledge of what April would ask of them, lined the path. The education had already begun,